Wednesday night, one-on-one nightly here coming at you on this November, what day is it? November 11th. Glad to be with you. Jackson Heil, Mike Calamari. Mike, a pleasure to be with you as always. Mike, we did nosebleeds last week.
Yep.
I said it was great to be back with the Calamari. Shout out Chris if you're listening tonight. And now I get to do one-on-one with the Calamari, so pretty stoked about it. How's everything going?
Yeah, everything's good. Glad to be here. First one-on-one of the school year on the Zoom format. And we got a lot of sports to talk about, a lot of late news that's been coming in the past few hours.
We sure do. And Mike, we were initially, when we did our rundown yesterday, we had no plans of even addressing the NBA. And now in the last 10 hours, we have some pretty interesting developments, and including one that happened about 90 minutes ago. But we'll get right into it right now after we address what we're doing on the show. Like I mentioned, NBA, we'll talk Jets and Giants. We'll talk what's going on in the NFL, Steve Cohen's press conference, Marcus Stroman staying in Queens, and obviously it's Masters Week, so we'll get a preview of all of that for you. But we don't got a lot of time, so we're going to get right into it, and we're starting with the NBA. Russell Westbrook, as of an hour and a half ago, according to Shams, wants out of Houston. And it was reported by Woj about 10 hours ago that Harden and Westbrook had addressed some concerns in the immediate future about what's going to go on with the Rockets. And now it's reported that Westbrook does want out. And Mike, I want to hear your initial reaction to this in a moment. But for me, what a disaster that is going on with the Rockets. This was a team that, if you go back a calendar year today, essentially, or even a little further than that, this was a team that had just paired two of the premier guards in the NBA and looked like a dynamic duo going forward. I mean, you could say what you want about your expectations for that going forward back then, but you had to say that the Rockets were in a pretty decent spot going forward. And now today it looks like Westbrook wants out. Harden apparently wants to stay, but it's a disaster in Houston. Mike, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say I saw this coming, but I really didn't. 1 year into this experiment, you got to think about what they gave up to get him, not only Chris Paul, but the draft picks as well. And Chris Paul looked phenomenal down the stretch with the Thunder, forcing the Game 7 in the playoffs. And it's just hard not to think that where do the Rockets go from here? Because if you trade Westbrook somewhere, what return do you get? Do you get draft picks? Do you want to rebuild now? Or do you want to try one last hurrah and try to get James Harden a ring? It's hard to say what route they take, or where do you even ship Westbrook? Where's left to go with him?
And that's an interesting point too, because where do the Rockets go from here? And Honestly, I look at this team now with Russell Westbrook wanting out in what's likely to be an already depleted market considering his contract, his age, the interest level, even in adding a guy like Westbrook, which we've now seen can get ugly for a team given that he just hasn't been in a situation outside of Kevin Durant where he's been able to go to an NBA Finals. I don't know how much interest is going to be available in Westbrook and what they're even going to get for him back in return. If I'm the Rockets from here and I see that Westbrook wants out and seeing just the roster that you're left with, I think I look to move James Harden too. And I know I mentioned that Harden wants to stay in Houston, but where is this team with Harden and the surrounding pieces that they have? And I know Daryl Morey put this 3-point shooting bonanza around him that he thought could be the future of the NBA. But Daryl Morey's gone now. Morey was the architect of this entire team, and he's now gone. You have a new front office in there. You have a new head coach there. Why not start new if I'm in Houston? Because I look at the Western Conference right now. I see plenty of teams in front of them that are better, specifically LA, the Clippers, well, the Lakers and the Clippers, I should say. The Nuggets, I think all three of those teams are head over heels better than them. I would even argue the Jazz are probably a better team than them. And that's with Westbrook. You take Westbrook out of the equation, yeah, you could consider him a detriment at times, but you're still taking out one of arguably the top 10 players in the NBA right now. So if I'm Houston, I'm blowing it all up right now. And what a terrible move this looks like, Mike, because we talk a lot about what Oklahoma City did in the offseason last year, trading away Russell Westbrook and trading away Paul George. We talk a ton about how bad the Paul George trade is going to look for the Clippers if they don't win a title going forward. I would argue that the Rockets trade for Russell Westbrook looks arguably worse right now because not only was Chris Paul a better fit in Oklahoma City than Russell Westbrook was, and probably a better fit in Houston as well, you got to consider the draft capital that they gave up, like you mentioned. And I believe it's a combination of like 2 first-round picks and 2 pick swaps, but it's ugly in Houston right now, and I think blowing it up is the way they have to go.
Yeah, definitely a big loss for Houston. And just looking at the Western Conference, you got to be looking at the Mavericks are going to be a better team next year. Doncic is going to be a year older, and he's probably going to be a top 5 player in the league. The Trailblazers are going to be back. They've got to be in the playoff hunt. And then you got the teams like Grizzlies, the Suns, who ended the playoff bubble great. So they could both be in the equation. The Rockets might not be in the playoff hunt next year if they lose Westbrook and don't get a good return. So, I mean, I got to agree that you got to blow this team up. It's going to be tough to move Harden, and I don't think they'll end up doing it. And I think they're going to stick by him and try to build around him and try to win a championship. But I think Westbrook was the last chance they had at it.
I questioned that trade at the time too, because I mean, you look at where the Rockets were in 2017. I mean, they're a game away from going to the NBA Finals against a team in Golden State that was viewed as one of the best teams in league history at that time with Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, yada, yada. And that was all without Chris Paul in Game 6 and Game 7 when they were up 3-2 in that series. Chris Paul, I thought, yeah, he had one down year in Houston, but I thought Chris Paul was a really good fit alongside James Harden. Yes, they're both guys who command the ball a lot, but having 2 primary ball handlers like that who are different stylistically. I mean, I'm not saying Harden and Westbrook aren't different stylistically because they obviously are, because Harden's obviously a monster from behind the arc, and that's where he makes a lot of his living, and that at the free throw line. Westbrook doesn't do any damage from behind the line, essentially. But Paul was a guy who was more of a facilitator off the dribble, mid-range pull-up guy, a guy who made teammates around him better. And we saw that this year in OKC. This trade didn't make sense to me at the time. It still doesn't now. And in terms of potential suitors for Russell Westbrook, it's hard to find a lot, Mike. It really is. I'm looking around the league right now, and I don't see really any good fits for Russell Westbrook, because I think the biggest thing for Russell Westbrook is you have to add him on a team that already has one bona fide superstar, let alone possibly 2 along with it. And where are you finding that right now? I mean, The Lakers, yes, but they have no capital to even think about adding him, especially after re-signing Chris Davis. Chris Davis. What am I saying? Anthony Davis. The Nets, who are not going near Russell Westbrook, let's just be honest there, with Kyrie Irving. That's really all I can think of in terms of teams that could potentially. I mean, would the Clippers pull the trigger on something there as a last-ditch effort? Maybe, but I don't think they have much available to even give up after the Paul George trade. The only team I could see maybe making a move for him, and I hate to say it, but it's New York Knicks. And as a Knicks fan, and upon many Knicks fans, I don't think anyone wants any part of Russell Westbrook. We've been there with Carmelo, and I'm not even going to go that route because Carmelo is a much different player than Russell Westbrook was, and a much more valuable player, in my opinion, than Russell Westbrook was at the time he got traded. But if I'm a Knicks fan, which I am, I want no part of trading for Russell Westbrook, personally.
Yeah, I mean, looking around the league, you're trying to find good fits, and you can't because there aren't any. And you can't create any fits that aren't there. So, I mean, the Knicks, I could totally see going after him. I think the Suns might be the only place where Westbrook could land maybe and make an impact. A team that had a great end to the bubble, going 8-0. But it's even hard to say how he would fit into that offense, thinking Devin Booker wants the ball in his hands, and is Westbrook's play style going to complement that? It's a tough situation. And I mean, even OKC doesn't sound like a bad fit, as crazy as that sounds. Of course, that wouldn't happen. But OKC is a better fit than a lot of these places. So I don't even think there's a potential suitor out there besides maybe a team like the Knicks that's just so desperate for some box office or something for fans to look forward to.
And here's the thing with Westbrook, too, because I think we're being a little harsh towards him right now. And it's because I think he is a borderline top 10 player in the NBA. I mean, we've seen what he can do scoring the basketball. He's won an MVP for a reason. He's a guy who's averaged a triple-double in the recent past, I should say. But he's not a guy that's a winning player. I'm sorry, but he's not a guy that you can build around and say, we're going to make a championship team out of Russell Westbrook, because you just can't. We saw what happened in Oklahoma City when they tried to do that after Kevin Durant left, and the numbers for Westbrook were spectacular, but it was clear that you couldn't win with them. And they tried adding Paul George and Melo around them, and the result was actually worse. So I am of the opinion that if I'm Russell Westbrook, I'm looking to do something similar to what Chris Paul did last year. Trade me to a team like the Knicks potentially, or somewhere that is almost a restart for him, where his value's low. He can be a guy who is leading young guys on a team like that that wants to take the next step towards the playoffs. That maybe isn't there yet, but he's a guy who I think, whether deservingly or not, he needs to rebuild his image. And it's not that he has a terrible image, but he needs to rebuild his basketball image, because right now he looks like a guy who is unplayable with stars. It's similar to what Chris Paul went through last year. I mean, you look at what Chris Paul did his last year in Houston. A lot of guys were calling Chris Paul completely toxic, and really not a whole lot of good teams wanted any part of him. Now, after 1 year in OKC where he became a leader, he accepted that challenge of being a leader on a young team surrounded with guys like Shai, Steven Adams, Dennis Schroeder coming off the bench. I think that's the route that Russell Westbrook has to go. And listen, the Knicks could be that option. I'm not saying that would be the right move for the Knicks, but I think that type of situation is where Russell Westbrook has to go. Because, I mean, you look at some teams interested in Chris Paul now, I think stars would be willing to play with Chris Paul again. And it didn't seem like that was the case last year. I mean, there was even a report from Ryan Russillo that Kawhi Leonard reached out to Chris Paul to try to get him to join up with the Clippers again, which would be kind of crazy with Chris Paul going all the way around the circle. But back to my point on Westbrook, I think that's the route that he should prefer to go.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that's the best way he makes his comeback after Houston. And I mean, his numbers in Houston weren't terrible. He shot a bad percentage from three, 25% compared to the year before. But I mean, he scored the ball well. His 2-point percentage was up, but he needs to find a way where he can be the primary ball handler again and be the leader of a team, and not. I think in a perfect world he can be paired with a star that would complement the play style, but I don't think that exists right now in the NBA. So I think if you go to a team like the Knicks, maybe the Bulls, he goes back with Billy Donovan as his coach, maybe somewhere like that where he could lead a group of guys, that could be a good fit for him. But you just got to say, what do these teams have to offer the Houston Rockets? Will Houston want to deal Westbrook to a team and maybe not get a return other than draft picks while they still have Harden?
It's crazy because, like, you look at a guy like Westbrook, and theoretically, he should be a guy that in a trade is probably worth a decent amount of value. But considering COVID-19 and where teams are at money-wise, considering the salary cap at the moment, and considering just his image as a ball player right now, I feel like the market could not be any lower right now, and the bar could not be any lower for Russell Westbrook, which is a good thing, I think, because I think if we have seen and we have learned anything about Russell Westbrook in his career, dude works hard. That dude comes to the gym every day. That dude comes to play, and you can't deny his work ethic, and you can't deny that he is going to show up at the gym every night because he is. And I think if you put him in a situation where he can rebuild his image, I think you made up a great point. Chicago would be a very interesting landing spot for him. I think New York, like I said, would be a great fit for him, but it's just hard to put the pieces together because what the heck is Houston going to ask for? Because I don't think anyone really knows what Russell Westbrook's market value is at right now in the NBA. So that obviously adds an interesting wrinkle to the NBA offseason. 9:15 here on One Nightly. We're on YouTube Live. We're on Twitter Live. Drop a comment on YouTube. Tweet at us at WFUV Sports if you want to get involved in the conversation. We're taking you to 10:30 here on Wednesday, November 12th. Coming up next, we got football talk. Sam Darnold, is he done in New York? I think so. Can the Giants win the NFC East? It's possible. We'll get to that and much more coming up next. Welcome back here on One Nightly. Jackson Heil, Mike Calamari here with you, bringing you till 10:30 on Twitter and YouTube Live. We're getting some football, and it's a little bit less of a depressing conversation this week. It has been quite ugly to talk about the Jets and Giants, and it still is. We're not going to deny that. I mean, the Jets are 0-9. The Giants have 2 wins now after their win against Washington on the road last week, but Mike, we're going to start with the Jets, and Monday Night Football comes around. They had a 10-point lead going into the fourth quarter here, and things were getting a little dicey if you're a Jets fan because, I mean, I know I'm one. I wasn't hunting for a victory on Monday night, that's for sure. I was hoping to go 0-9. I was hoping to go 0-16 this season, and it looked like the Jets were going to win a game. It was pretty remarkable, and you were just imagining throughout this, at least I was, that is Bill Belichick throwing this game? Because I honestly thought there was a chance. If I'm Bill Belichick, I know I don't want to face Trevor Lawrence for the next 15 plus years. And listen, if he threw that game, wouldn't have blamed him entirely. But again, the Pats come back. Nick Folk, who's a Jets legend, I'm willing to say that, kicks the game-winning field goal and continues his legendary run for Jets fans to send them to 0-9. But Mike, I want to give you my main takeaway from this game, and I'll let you give your thoughts on this in a moment. I think this game proved to me that Sam Darnold is not the guy in New York. And I know that might sound crazy coming off of, listen, he didn't even play, but Joe Flacco looked like a stud. And yes, he had every weapon back for almost the first time this year, with Perriman, Crowder, and Denzel Mims being all healthy for the first time. And you're going up against a New England defense that is depleted by injuries, yada, yada. But Joe Flacco looked terrific. And we haven't seen anything close to that from Sam Darnold this year. Yes, we've seen him make plays in spurts, but from an overall performance perspective, that's the best quarterback performance I've seen from any Jet this year. And it's against the Pats, too. And listen, like I mentioned before, this Pats defense is marred by injuries at the moment and COVID opt-outs and whatnot. But this is still a Bill Belichick coach team. And Joe Flacco tore him to shreds like he's done his entire career, even when he was in Baltimore, to be honest. But I watched this game and said, if Joe Flacco can do that without Mekhi Becton for the large portion of this game, not really with a great offensive line in front of him and pretty much no run game, then I got to see the same from Sam Darnold. And we haven't seen anything close to that this year. And I'm not saying that Sam Darnold doesn't have talent, because he has plenty of it. And I think that if Sam Darnold was in a different situation, he could succeed. But I think we've found out that Sam Darnold is not going to succeed in this situation. And it stinks, because I think if he was brought into a little bit better of a situation coming out of college, we would be talking about a completely different Sam Darnold. But that has not been the case. We're in year 3 now with Sam Darnold, and he looks like a guy who's kind of seeing ghosts every time he's out there. And that stinks, because he doesn't deserve that. But that's the unfortunate reality of what we're facing. And I think, as crazy as that may sound, I think Monday night was the last straw for me that said, if Joe Flacco can do that in that offense, then it's not entirely Adam Gase that's the problem. It's a large portion is on Sam Darnold as well. And Adam Gase is a huge problem in itself and a separate one. But I think it's time to move on from Sam Darnold. And if they get the number 1 pick or even the number 2 pick, it's got to be Trevor Lawrence or it's got to be Justin Fields.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree that I think Darnold's time in New York has come to an end. I wouldn't say his time as a quarterback in the league has gone away, because I think there's a chance he goes to a place where he can play under a quarterback, maybe Pittsburgh, where he plays under Big Ben, similar play styles there, and then he can assume a starting role in a couple of years. But I think the fact that he's been thrown into this position with the Jets and he's gotten worse. I mean, he has the worst passer rating, worst QBR in his 3 years with the team this year, and the offense is the least yards per game out of any team in the league. So I think it's obvious that this isn't the fit. And you can say things about the Jets not having the weapons for Darnold to succeed, or Adam Gase, but I think at a certain point when it's your 3rd year with the team, that you can't be making all those excuses, and you got to show some promise. I mean, too many times with Sam Darnold, one game you're saying this guy's legit, he's the real deal, and then the next game it's just like, we need to find a quarterback. And I think the Jets need to find a way where maybe you deal Darnold to a contender and get some sort of return, and then move on from him in the next year's draft.
I agree with you in the fact that I don't think he's done as a quarterback in this league. I truly believe that if you put him in a situation with talent around him and weapons, he can be a guy who's in top of the league quarterback in terms of being a top 15 guy in the entire NFL. And I truly believe that, because I think if you look at in year 1 and year 2, yes, there were issues and the turnovers are certainly a problem, but this is a guy who, let's be honest, has had arguably the 2 worst coaches in the NFL in Todd Bowles and Adam Gase, who I think is the worst head coach in the history of professional sports, and I've been documented saying that. However, like you mentioned, This is year 3. You were expecting a jump from him this year. And listen, the pieces have not been there. That is for certain. No one's been healthy. The offensive line's been a disaster, and the schedule has been terrible. But we have seen a Sam Darnold that has regressed. And injuries have been a factor in that. And a lack of talent has also been a big contributor there. But the fact of the matter is Sam Darnold's going in the opposite direction. And I don't know if the Jets can ill afford to pass up on Trevor Lawrence. Actually, I shouldn't say I don't know. They can't afford to pass up on Trevor Lawrence because this is a guy who's clearly a generational type talent who wherever he goes, he's going to have success. Like he's a guy who's going to succeed in any situation, I think. And that will obviously vary in terms of degrees of success depending on the talent around him, but he's going to have success in the NFL. And the Jets can't afford to miss out on that type of talent. And honestly, I believe the same about Justin Fields. Justin Fields is not on Trevor Lawrence's level, but he is a guy where I think that he's going to be a successful quarterback in the NFL. Unless we said the same things about Darnold coming out of college, and we were wrong. But a large portion of that has been because he has been completely deteriorated by an incompetent organization in the New York Jets.
I think a big question would be, are you worried if you're the Jets that you draft another quarterback and you put him in the same situation as Darnold? Are you just ushering in a QB to not succeed? And I think that's a big question too. And Trevor Lawrence is a generational talent. So I feel like if he is the guy you're picking, then that's not a worry. But there have been talks that maybe Trevor Lawrence, does he stay with Clemson for another year? And I know
we're not doing that
earlier. But
we're not doing this.
I think if that's the case, you reach for a guy like Fields. Now, I do think that Lawrence is going to go to the draft. I don't see him staying in Clemson, even though people have been saying that. If he goes into this draft, the Jets are taking him. But if not, then you have a question about what you're going to do.
It would be an outrageous decision for Trevor Lawrence to stay at school. And I think that would be arguably the worst decision any quarterback has made in terms of a draft. I mean, let's look at it. Jake Locker, potential number 1 overall pick, stays at Washington, I believe, ends up out of the league. Matt Barkley, potential number 1 draft pick, stays at USC, ends up being a second or third round pick the next year. And Trevor Lawrence is not going to be that, obviously. But my point is this. You are leaving millions upon millions of dollars on the table and potentially a lot more if he ends up somewhere other than New York. Because here's my thing about Trevor Lawrence, like not wanting to go to the New York Jets. And there's reason for that if Adam Gase is still here. Well, let's be honest. Adam Gase is not going to be here next year. If he is, then the Jets should fold the entire organization and secede to the XFL, which doesn't exist at the moment. That's where they belong if Adam Gase is still the head coach of the New York Jets next year. But Gase is not going to be here. You're going to have a new head coach, hopefully someone like Eric Bieniemy who's going to be able to run an offense. And you have a guy in Joe Douglas with the most cap space in the entire NFL, and you're in one of the best markets in the NFL, being New York. Yeah, it's East Rutherford, but it's the New York market. So you put Trevor Lawrence in that situation. I'd argue there are a few other situations that you could want to be in if you're Trevor Lawrence, especially because you know he's a transcendent talent. Winning in New York would not only put him on a pedestal that few could ever touch, but let's talk about the marketing deals that he's going to get. They're going to be insane, especially for a quarterback in New York. If he's going to be successful, oh my God, he's going to get marketing deals out the wazoo on top of a monster contract if he's successful in New York. I think there's very few ceilings he could choose that would end up being better than New York. So for him to stay at Clemson could be a potential decision to leave hundreds of $1 million on the table. And listen, I want to bring up Duane Wagner for a second too, who was a former Memphis basketball player, played under John Calipari, who wanted to go back to school. And Calipari said, no, you are going to the draft because you have to make money. He goes to the NBA, He ends up getting a career-ending, I forget exactly what it was, but it was like a career-ending like illness or something. And he would have been done if he stayed at Memphis. No money, not really too much of an education to work with. The injury risk, especially in football, is so much bigger than what it is in the NBA. So for Trevor Lawrence, if I'm in his shoes, I don't care if I love Clemson. I don't care if I love Dabo Sweeney. The people around him got to be telling him, you better go to that draft, man, because it's the best decision for him.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with that 100%. And look at the other options. I mean, you wait a year and you get Jacksonville maybe as the team to
Yeah,
go into.
exactly.
I mean, I'm taking New York, even if it's like in New Jersey, East Rutherford. I'm still taking New York City, that brand. And imagine being the guy who comes in there and leads the Jets to a playoffs. Maybe not the first year you're there, but the second or third year. If I'm Trevor Lawrence, I'm thinking about that possibility. I mean, even for Joe Burrow, would you rather be in his shoes and playing for the Bengals right now? I personally would rather for the Jets, even if they're the worst team in the league by a long stretch.
Market is such a huge thing when it comes to money. And listen, I'll bring up another NBA example. I mean, Carmelo Anthony, even though he didn't win in New York, James Dolan probably made that dude so much money during his time in New York. I mean, imagine if he stayed out in Denver with the Nuggets. There's no chance he's making anywhere close to the money he would have made just from the marketing deals in New York alone and being around successful people. If Trevor Lawrence is in New York, that's going to be the same thing. And also, just from an ego perspective, being in New York and winning in New York, especially with the Jets, is nearly an impossible task as it's viewed right now. So if I'm Trevor Lawrence and I believe in myself and I believe in that talent, I want that challenge. I want to come to the New York Jets and I want to win here because it hasn't been done in what seems like an eternity. And because it really is an eternity, it's been since Super Bowl III. And there's a reason we view, as Jets fans, Joe Namath in the way that we do, because he is a hero to this franchise. And Trevor Lawrence really could be that second guy coming. So 9:30 here on One Nightly. We're going to get to the Giants after this break, but we got plenty of NFL talk otherwise to get into. The Steelers are undefeated, escaping in Jerry World. And I got some things to say about Tom Brady because I'm still not a believer of what he's doing in Tampa Bay. Well, we're taking it till 10:30. Again, drop a comment on Twitter at WFUV Sports, on our YouTube page on YouTube Live, WFUV Sports. Be sure to hit us up if you got anything to say. But again, Giants talk, NFL talk. We'll be right back. on Twitter and YouTube Live. And Mike, we talked a lot about the Jets in our previous segment, and we're shifting over to the Giants now, specifically the NFC East as a whole. And listen, you can't mention the NFC East without mentioning calamity, disaster. Every negative word in the dictionary can apply to this division because it's one of the worst in NFL history, and that's not even an exaggeration at this point. It was bad last year. It was bad the year before, to be quite honest, as well. And I didn't think it could stoop any lower, but they have managed to do that this year. And Mike, you mentioned a stat before we started the show that the Eagles at 3-4-1 are bigger favorites to win the NFC East right now than the undefeated Steelers are to win the AFC North. That's how bad this division is. And honestly, I don't think the Eagles are going to end up winning this division. And I said a few weeks ago on this show that if the Eagles didn't win the NFC East, that everyone in that organization should be fired. And I think I still stand by that because the talent is there. But I don't think it's crazy to think that the Giants are going to win this division right now. And yes, they have 2 wins, and they've both come against a team that has officially been named the Washington football team. And that says a lot about the Giants this year. But if we go through this Giants schedule at 2-5, there's a good argument that this team could easily be 4-3, even 3-4, which would put them at a spot to win the division. I mean, the Giants have been in almost every game this year. The only game that they got their doors blown off of was against the 49ers. And again, you have a dud every once in a while. But I look at this Giants team. As crazy as it sounds, I see enough talent on defense to get them through. And again, it's a low bar to clear in the NFC East, but I see enough talent there. I see a schedule going forward that's pretty favorable. And I see an Eagles team that, yes, they've been playing better lately, but I see a very beatable Eagles team in front of them. And the Giants play the Eagles this week, and the Giants should have won that first game on Monday night on the road. If the Giants win this week, I'm putting them in the driver's seat to win this division. I really am. And I don't think it's all that crazy to think. What do you think?
I'm still picking the Eagles. When I look at the Giants, I see a team that's been in a lot of games, like you said. I mean, a bunch of their games this year have been decided by 1 score or less. But when it comes down to it, I just think that their inability to close out games is going to bite them in the behind when it comes down to closing it out and trying to get ahead of this. So I'm still picking the Eagles to win this one. And if I had to say, I think if you look back on it, the Giants-Eagles game earlier in the year is going to be the game you're going to look back on and say, if we get a different result, I mean, you're talking about a Giants team that was up late into that game, and it was almost like it would be hard for them to try and lose this game. So I think for that reason, I'm still picking the Eagles. I haven't seen enough out of the Giants offense this year. The defense has not been there too. They've struggled on both sides of the field. I think that when one thing's working, the other thing's not. So I still think the Eagles have the best chance to win it this year, even though I'm not overly impressed with them.
Would your opinion change if the Giants win on Sunday against the Eagles?
Yeah, because it's the divisional matchup, but I just don't think they will. I don't think the Giants are going to go in there, beat Philadelphia.
Fair enough. I mean, listen, it might be a crazy take. I might be a little delusional. I've said some things on this podcast that may come off as crazy as well. So I'm not opposed to that opinion, but let's just look at this Giants schedule right now. I mean, they're beating Pittsburgh for a decent portion of that game. They end up losing, but again, that's a Steelers team that hasn't lost yet. Lost on the final play to the Bears. Had a drive in the final few minutes against the Rams to tie that game. Should have beat the Cowboys, but lose on a last-second field goal. They beat the Washington football team, blow that game against the Eagles, miss a 2-point conversion against the Bucs. Like, those are all winnable games against some pretty good teams, too. And I look at this Giants schedule down the stretch. And yes, there are obviously some tough games, but I think 6 games win this division. And that might sound crazy for any division, but I think 6 or 7 games is realistically going to win this division.
6 wins overall, not 6 more for the rest. 6 wins.
No. 6 wins in general could win this division. And that's insane to think about, but it's possible. And if they beat Philadelphia, they're 3-5, followed by a matchup against the Bengals following the bye week, against the Seahawks, which I think is a very winnable game. I'm not a believer in the Seahawks, but I think that's a very winnable game. The Cardinals, who haven't looked great recently, the Browns, which is a winnable game, they'll probably lose to the Ravens. And then the Cowboys at home, who have looked disastrous since losing Dak Prescott. So I see 6 or 7 wins on this Giants schedule. And that might sound crazy for a team that's 2-5 with their only 2 wins being over Washington, but I see a team that can win this division. I really do. And I'm not saying they're going to, but if they beat Philadelphia this weekend, I am a prime believer that the Giants are the favorites to win the NFC East.
I will say that if they beat Philadelphia, then there's a big discussion to be had. But I still have big questions about the Giants. The offensive line worries me. They're young, and they definitely need another piece there to build up that offensive line. And the defense has gotten better because of Patrick Graham. But I still think there's pieces there that need to be filled, and I don't think they're ready to make the next step and win this division. And I think the Eagles are just going to, in the end, win it and come out, even if it's by a game or two. I think the Giants are just in too big of a hole at 2-7 to make it out.
It's going to be ugly to watch it go forward. There's no doubt about that. Whatever happens, the winner of this division is going to be wasting a playoff spot, which is unfortunate, but that is the reality of what is the NFC East right now. And I don't want to talk about it anymore because it is horrible to talk about because it's one of the worst divisions in football I've ever seen. But let's move on to some general NFL talk here. And I want to talk about what happened on Sunday Night Football because as someone who was in Tampa last weekend, me and my buddies were contemplating pushing our flights back to go watch this Saints-Bucs game. And my God, am I happy I didn't spend the money to do so because what an ugly affair that was in Tampa Bay. The Saints win 38-3. They were up 31-0 in the first half, which says it all about where this game went and how it happened so quickly. But I want to have a conversation about Tom Brady real quick because I've come on this show before, last time with Andrew, and I said that I think Drew Brees isn't the guy in New Orleans. And listen, you could argue that either way. I'm a Jameis guy, but I think he'd be a better fit for that offense. But at least Drew Brees can go out and put points on the board like he did with his weapons. Tom Brady just put up 3 points against a Saints defense that, let's be honest, it's not very good. It's one of the, I would argue, worst secondaries in the NFL. And they put up 3 points, and Tom Brady throws 3 picks and turns the ball over a ton. Tom Brady's washed up. Yeah, the Bucs are 6-3, but Tom Brady's washed up, guys. I need to say it because you look at this Bucs team, and yeah, he had a good week against Oakland. I'm not going to deny that. Oakland, Vegas, apologies. Tom Brady is playing on a Bucs team that has one of the best defenses in the league and one of the better D coordinators in Todd Bowles, who, yes, he's not a good head coach, but he's a damn good defensive coordinator with a ton of talent around him. He's got tons of weapons. I mean, let's look at that, go down the list here. Chris Godwin, who was the best slot receiver in the NFL last year. Mike Evans, who's one of the better deep threats in the game. Rob Gronkowski, who is arguably the best tight end of all time. And now Antonio Brown, who has an argument to be one of the best wide receivers of all time. And yeah, Brown's first week back last week, he's clearly not washed up, though. And Gronk clearly isn't washed up. And certainly Godwin and Evans aren't. And he's got a great run game, a great offensive line. And he just put up 3 points at home against a not very good Saints defense. And I want to bring up a stat for you real quick. Lowest percentage of throws on target this year. Let's go through the bottom 5. Drew Lock, Dwayne Haskins, Carson Wentz, Sam Darnold, Tom Brady. It's not exactly great company. It really isn't. And yes, the Bucs are going to put up points because the pieces around Tom Brady are terrific. But this is last year's Patriots team all over again. Elite defense. They didn't have great weapons around Brady, but a great defense that's going to carry them places, and they're going to fall short because they don't have the quarterback to do it. And I'm a full believer that Tom Brady is not that quarterback.
I mean, when you say Tom Brady's washed up, I disagree there. I mean, I don't think he needs to be MVP Tom Brady from the Patriots to take this team to the playoffs or deep into the playoffs. I think he just needs to be someone who can complete passes and then be good in the red zone. And I think he has been all up until last week. I mean, I've got this big stat from last week. Under pressure, 46% of his dropbacks. First 8 games, 14%. So I think that just shows you the offensive line had a brutal night against the Saints. Ali Marpet was out. He's back to practice today. So I think both those things bode well for them going forward. I think that you can make the case that that's probably the biggest reason Brady didn't have a good night. And Brady, we both know, recently has been bad under pressure. If you give Brady time, then I think that's going to help him. So I think that it's too soon to call this Bucs team off. I'm not a believer that they're a Super Bowl contender, but I still think they're the second best team in that division. I think that they're going to make it deep into the playoffs and be a threat. And it's too tough to count Tom Brady up. It's just too tough.
I don't think I'm counting the Bucs out. I like this Bucs team. I think defensively, this is a team that's going to carry them pretty far, honestly. And I'm not saying they're going to the Super Bowl. They're not Super Bowl contenders because they don't have enough offensively and they don't have enough at quarterback in Tom Brady. But like I said, I mean, the company this year that he's carrying just throws on target. He's missing 25% of the time. You can't have that with the weapons that he has. And I think I agree with your point that last week he was under a ton of pressure. And I don't care who you are. When you're over the age of 40, if you're under pressure all the time, you're going to be in trouble just because you can't move. I mean, Drew Brees would be in the same sentence here if he was under that type of pressure. But overall, I think the reason that the Bucs have had success to this point, it's not because of Tom Brady. It's because of what they've done on the defensive side of the football. It's what their run game has been able to do, because I'm a big believer in Ronald Jones. Leonard Fournette has been a really nice complementary piece as well. And they have guys out on the outside, like I mentioned, Evans, Godwin, Gronkowski, Brown. The list goes on in terms of weapons that they have that are all-time greats. And I mean literal all-time greats at the skill positions. And the offensive line has been good this year. Yes, it wasn't good on Sunday night, but again, I think that the Bucs' success to this point and the Bucs' success going forward is entirely reliant on what they're doing defensively, because I'd argue they have the best defense in football right now. And listen, their direction, I think Pittsburgh's a conversation there for sure, and Pittsburgh probably is number one, but there's an argument for the Bucs having the best defense in the National Football League right now. And I think that is where their success is. A team I also want to address right now before we go to break, Seattle Seahawks, who right now are basically entirely reliant on where Russell Wilson can take them. Because you look at this Seahawks team, man, they can't stop anyone. And they finally got healthy last week. I mean, Dunlap was back, Jamal Adams was back, and Josh Allen threw for 300 yards in the first half last week. This Seahawks defense is an atrocity. And I want to give you a stat. I don't even have the stat on me right now, but I remember seeing this on Twitter this past week. I think Jamal Adams amongst safeties is ranked like 58th in coverage right now. And the Seahawks just gave up a first-round pick for him, a third-round pick, and Bradley McDougald for him. Joe Douglas looks pretty good in that trade department right there. And as a Jet fan who saw Jamal Adams complain his ass off the entire time in his last few months in New York, he's not walking the walk right now in Seattle. And am I going to claim that Jamal Adams is a system safety just for narrative purposes? Maybe. But he's not getting the job done in Seattle right now. And that entire defense as a whole stinks. And that's why I'm not a believer in the Seahawks right now. I honestly don't even know who the best team in the NFC is right now. Maybe the Packers with Aaron Rodgers playing the way he is, but it certainly isn't Seattle because Russell Wilson has taken a step back these past few weeks. I honestly think the favorite in that division might be the Cardinals right now, but it certainly isn't the Seahawks, and I had to address that.
No, I mean, I totally agree. I mean, this Seahawks defense is brutal. And the worst part is their coverage and their secondary has been easily the worst part about this defense. And you got to think that maybe is Jamal Adams the transition the problem for him, but I think he's just not playing up to what he should be playing. I think this one stat's big. Seahawks against wide receivers this year, 1,885 yards. That's the amount of yards wide receivers have put up against them. It's 400 more yards than the next team on the list. So I think that just shows you that this defense cannot cover anything. And, I mean, Russell Wilson's been playing superhero ball. He's done that his whole career with this team. And when the defense isn't there and the offensive line isn't there, he got knocked down 16 times last week. I think this team is just running out of fuel, and it's going to come to a time where they're not going to be able to get it done come playoff time. I mean, with the expanded playoffs, they'll definitely be there, but they're definitely one or two rounds they might not make it through if this defense can't stop a nosebleed.
So here's the mark on Adams, by the way. I was giving him too much credit, way too much credit, actually. 78th out of 92 safeties in coverage this year. And the Seahawks gave up 2 firsts, a third, and Bradley McDougald for him. That ain't good. As a Jet fan, you just hate to see that. You really hate to see that. But, yeah, I'm in agreement. I don't think the Seahawks are going really anywhere this year. Just because I don't think they can do it defensively. And they've shown that.
Cam Newton converts that in the red zone a touchdown against the Seahawks, then they have a different record, and the Patriots have a better chance maybe.
Yeah. I mean, Cam Newton put up 30 points against the Seahawks. I mean, that says it all. And I believe Wilson gave a pick 6 in that game, but the point still stands that the Seahawks defense is not getting it done. They don't get any pressure, which I think is a big part of the problem as well. Because honestly, you look at their secondary, it should be a lot better than it is talent-wise. I mean, Griffin, Adams, Dunlap, those are guys who can play, and they're simply not getting the job done right now. So that's my diagnostic on Seattle. Let's talk about the AFC North for a minute too before we head into break. And you mentioned it before the show that this Steelers team has less of a chance to win the AFC North than the Eagles do. I mean, it makes sense, though. I mean, realistically, because I think that even with how good the Steelers have looked this year, they've had some close calls. I mean, especially last week against Dallas. I mean, if Dallas has anything resembling an NFL caliber quarterback last week, then they win that football game. And I'm not entirely sold on the Steelers winning the Super Bowl. I know they are, 9-0 right now, and
8-0.
8-0. Apologies. 8-0 right now, and look like the best team in football. But I'm just a little concerned about them playing down to competition early in the postseason. That's my only worry about them, because you put them against the best teams out there, they're going to come and bring it every night. And credit to Ben Roethlisberger, too, because he looks like a stud this year. He looks reborn. He looks rejuvenated. But I am not entirely convinced that they win this division. I think the Ravens are still a team that can compete in this division, and they certainly will, and they're certainly going to be a playoff team. But I think this division comes down to whoever wins this second matchup between Pittsburgh and Baltimore. And if history tells us anything, the Ravens are winning the second matchup too, because you haven't had a rivalry in sports as competitive as the Ravens and Steelers, other than UNC do, but that's college basketball. The Ravens and Steelers seemingly split every single year, or at least find a way to split every single year. It wasn't the case last year, and it may not be this year, but I still think the Ravens may find a way to win this division, just because I've seen the Steelers have a little too many close calls.
And as remaining schedules go, just to go off that, I think the Ravens have an easier schedule moving forward. The Titans and the Steelers are their only really competitive games. They've got the Patriots, Cowboys, Browns, Jacksonville, Giants, and Bengals. I mean, those are a lot of free wins. I mean, they might drop one of those at most, but outside of the Titans and the Steelers, they have an easy schedule moving forward. So I think that puts them in a good position. And the Steelers, I mean, they've been great defensively, and Ben Roethlisberger's been playing out of his mind. Chase Claypool has also been the emergence of maybe potential number one receiver for that team. Juju's been great, but Claypool's really been dominant for that team. Mm-hmm. So the Steelers do have a lot that is good for them, and they're clearly going to be top of the AFC, maybe not the top or the division, but they'll be right there in the mix. So they shouldn't be worried about winning the division, I don't think, as the top priority, but especially with this new 18 format that we were talking about before the show that might just eliminate the byes. But I still think that the Ravens have the best shot probably to win this division, even though it's tough for me to say as a Steelers fan.
So, and also just looking at the schedule too for Pittsburgh before we wrap it up. I mean, they have a pretty easy slate for the most part, but again, they have to play in Buffalo. They got to play Indianapolis, who's good. And they got to play in Cleveland too, which at Cleveland, you can make your opinion on what they are, but still having to play them on the road to finish out the season is a difficult task. And yeah, they got Washington, the Bengals twice worked in there, the Jaguars, who are an atrocity as well. But it's going to be interesting to watch. And I really do think that it comes down to whoever wins that matchup in Pittsburgh between the Ravens and the Steelers. When is it? End of November. So that's going to be a fun race to watch. Certainly a lot to watch going forward in the NFL as well, and we'll be sure to talk about it as things happen going forward. But we're going to take a quick break. Again, we got a little over 35 minutes here on One Nightly. Hit us up on Twitter. Hit us up on YouTube Live. You want your opinion heard, we'll get to it on the show. Just drop us a comment, a concern, a question, whatever you got for us here on One Nightly. Jackson Isle, Mike Calamari. We're talking Mets coming up next. Here on One Nightly, Jackson Isle, Mike Calamari here with you just past 9:55, about 35 more minutes for you until we wrap things up once again on YouTube Live, on Twitter Live, and we're talking Mets. Before I get to that, though, I just want to address something that I saw earlier today. One of the coolest things I've seen in a lifetime, and really doesn't have anything to do, well, it does have to do with sports, but ESPN had a bunch of layoffs earlier this past week, and they laid off a ton of guys, and they laid off Chris Cote, who's a producer on the Dan Le Batard show, and apparently everyone was blindsided by it. I personally don't watch the Dan Le Batard show. I'm not usually awake to watch it, to be quite honest with you. But Dan announced on the show today that Chris is sticking around and that Dan is going to be paying his salary plus a raise to stick around. Which is really cool. I just wanted to shout out Dan Le Batard because that's just really cool. It takes a lot to do that. Obviously, that's probably for a producer on ESPN. He's making a significant amount of money, and obviously so is Dan. But that's just really cool, and it just shows that the type of guy that he is. So quick shout out there. Just wanted to get that on the show because that was one of the coolest things I saw today. And with so many people getting laid off in this job market, I hope we have more people in this world like Dan Le Batard to do that, and shows you how good Chris Cote is at his job. So moving on from that, just wanted to get that out there. Let's talk some Mets because Steve Cohen introduced this week, official press conference. He is the new owner of the New York Mets. A new era has come upon us in Flushing. And Mike, I had a few takeaways from his press conference, and I want to hear yours momentarily. But just from watching Steve Cohen talk and just the energy and the care that he carries, it already feels different from the Wilpons. And he hasn't spent a dime yet, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, the minute he got there, he laid off just about everyone in that front office, and rightfully so, because Brody Van Wagen, I thought was the worst GM in baseball at the time, and he sent everyone packing and brought Sandy Alderson in as the president. But what I got from watching that press conference is that Steve Cohen is a Mets fan with money, and he's going to spend it. And I think we all knew that, and I think there was no doubt that that was going to be the case with Steve Cohen, but I really wanted to hear it in person, and I really wanted, if I was a Mets fan, I would have wanted to officially see that this is going to happen. And I think this press conference proved that they're not messing around. And I think that is great for baseball. Not only just for the Mets, but for baseball, because the New York market is critical to all sports because it is probably the biggest market in the world. And to have the Yankees alone is just massive because of their success. But to add the Mets to the equation and the way they're going to spend, and for the Mets to just be sharks in the market and be consistently competitive, that's going to be massive, not only for New York fans, not only for Met fans, but for the game of baseball as a whole. It makes the game better to have owners like Steve Cohen involved in the sport. And hopefully more people like Steve Cohen will be owners going forward, because as we saw with the Wilpons, it's not always like that. The Wilpons had no interest in putting anything into this organization. It was their primary source of business. For Steve Cohen, obviously, to be a guy who's worth $14 billion and have the pleasure to be able to do this for a team that you love, it's great to see. But my biggest takeaway from him being introduced was that the league needs more people like Steve Cohen in charge of baseball teams, because going forward, this Mets team, I have no doubts, is going to be a big player, not only in the free agent market, but just a big player in terms of competing for championships going forward because of the mindset, because of the energy, and because of the passion that Steve Cohen brings to this organization.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. There's a couple quotes that stuck out to me. He said, "It's not about making the money; it's about building something great." That would quote his words, and I think that really shows you where his mindset. And he also talked about how he's doing this for the fans, and that's his main priority, to give something back to the fans, because they've been without so much as Mets fans for so long. And I think those are things you rarely see from a person in his position. And if you're a Met fan, you got to be optimistic, and you're even more optimistic now that you re-signed Marcus Stroman. As soon as Steve Cohen gets in there, you think about action, and that's a huge move for the Mets, spending money. And so you're really optimistic as a Mets fan. It's a good time to be a Mets fan, and you really say that recently.
It certainly is. And you brought up Marcus Stroman. I'm going to get to him in a little bit, but I want to make a few more points about Cohen just in general, because I've said this on past shows, and I'll say it again right now. The most important thing that Steve Cohen can do is get the right people in charge, because I like Sandy Alderson. I think he's actually the perfect guy right now to be in charge of all this, because you need to have someone as an owner that you can trust. And listen, I don't think Sandy Alderson would be a great general manager by any means, and I don't think he was a great general manager. He was fine, and he did his job under limitations, of course, from the Wilpons, but I think Alderson's a perfect guy for the situation that they have now, because he's not a guy that is going to carry an ego, and he's a guy who's willing to help. He's going to be the top man. I was talking to Dave Spampanato about this before, but he's going to be that top guy on that ledge who's going to be essentially the one that they report to. Yes, Cohen's obviously in charge of everything, but Alderson's going to be in charge of hiring everyone. And if we know anything from Steve Cohen, they're going to go big fish hunting, not only in free agency, but in the front office. And that's the most important thing they can do. And I want to point to something here, because there's not really a ton of big names available that would be a good fit for the New York Mets this offseason. What I think the Mets should do, not necessarily should do, but what I necessarily think they are going to do is, Theo Epstein's contract expires after this year in Chicago. And it's pretty much universally known that he's done after this year with the Cubs. Is there a better fit than Theo Epstein right now in New York? I don't know if there is right now. Epstein is a guy who we've seen do it in Boston. We see him do it in Chicago. And yes, he has soured out there eventually. But if Cohen is going to go big game hunting in the front office, I don't think there's many guys I'd rather have than Theo Epstein in charge. He won 2 World Series with the Red Sox. He finally ended the curse in Chicago. I think Epstein's a perfect fit for what Steve Cohen wants to do because he wants a guy who's universally respected in both markets, not only in baseball, but in the analytics department, which Theo Epstein certainly is. He wants a guy who can put the right people in charge, which Theo has certainly done in both places that he's worked with Tito and Joe Madden. And Theo Epstein is going to make a lot of money wherever he gets his new job. And, well, would you look at Steve Cohen, a guy who wants to spend all the money in the world on his toy in the New York Mets? I think it's a perfect fit. I think it's something that if the Mets are willing to be patient, which they should be because they want to do this right, which they haven't done in the past, I think waiting a year for Theo Epstein makes a lot of sense for the New York Mets.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think it would be a good move for Theo Epstein too. I mean, it would just be another notch on his resume to go and end this drought for the Mets that they've been in. And he's done it in Boston, like you said, in Chicago. If he went to New York and did it, you'd be looking at someone who many would consider maybe an all-time general manager. So that seems like it would also make sense on Theo Epstein's side for his next move as a general manager. So I think that's a really good point, and I definitely could see Steve Cohen waiting a year and then making that move.
And I think Sandy Alderson is okay in that role for this year because as long as you're not going to panic in year one and go out and just spend everything to prove everything, I think Steve Cohen's earned that trust with fans already because of just how incompetent the Wilpons were in terms of owning this franchise. It appears that Steve Cohen has gained the respect of Mets fans to say, hey, we're not going to go big spending, we're going to smart spend. Because I think there's a significant difference between the two. Just look at the Angels, for example. They've gone out and spent tons of money on Albert Pujols, Josh Hamilton, Anthony Rendon, and Mike Trout even. And again, not all those are bad moves. You extended the best player in the world right now. You signed one of the best third basemen in the game, but they haven't spent in places where they've needed to spend. I think Steve Cohen, like I said, the biggest thing he can do is get the right people in charge to spend in the right spots. Because if this Mets team is going to operate like when the Yankees went out and signed Jacoby Ellsbury and Brian McCann and all those guys, this team's going to be in trouble going forward because they're going to put themselves into bad contracts. The luxury tax is going to be an issue. And again, it doesn't seem like money's ever going to be an issue with Steve Cohen, but I don't care how you slice it. You just can't have so many big contracts at one time. The Mets need to spend in the right spots, and I think you need to get the right people in place to do that, to guide Steve Cohen to a point where you can essentially say, hey, this is where we need, this is what we need, and this is how we're going to spend all this money that you want me to spend. And listen, Theo Epstein has had problems spending money in the past. I'm not going to deny that. I mean, just look at Jason Hayward, Tyler Chatwood in Chicago, and Boston, Adrian Gonzalez and Carl Crawford are two examples of terrible expenditures by him. But he's a guy who gets it, and he's a guy who's won. He's a guy who knows the ins and outs of the game, and he's a guy who I think is also at the forefront of where baseball is going on top of that, which says a lot about Theo because he's been around the game for so long. It says a lot about his intelligence going forward. So assuming he's done in Chicago, I think that would be the perfect fit.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree, and I think that's where the Mets probably go in the new direction that Steve Cohen's going to take them. And I think what you also got to start thinking about is that do they start this offseason maybe picking up some new players, and where do they take this team to maybe make a playoff hunt? And Steve Cohen, the way he was talking, he seems that he wants success immediately. So it's going to be interesting to see how he molds this team or how he leads this team to maybe a potential playoff hunt. We'll see. It depends a lot on how this free agency plays out.
Mm-hmm. And I think that before we go to Stroman quick, I think that the Mets can spend this offseason even if they don't have the future GM or president of baseball ops in there, because I think Sandy Alderson is trustworthy enough in the position as just president and the overseer of all things that he can be the guy in charge for a year and spend, because we've seen what he can do in the past, and Steve Cohen clearly trusts him to do this type of stuff in not just in adding personnel, but in terms of hiring people as well. So I think JT Realmuto should definitely be in play for the Mets this offseason because catching is clearly a massive need. Trevor Bauer should be in play, also depending on the contract. And that's even without if Theo Epstein being here or whoever there decides their future GM. I just don't think the Mets should rush into committing to anyone as the future of their front office going forward because we've seen that happen in the past, and it clearly failed miserably with Brodie Van Wagenen. So that's my final piece on the Mets, and we'll see what the manager situation is going forward too. I don't want to get entirely into it, but I think that committing to Luis Rojas as the guy going forward isn't the best decision. But again, that remains to be seen, giving him a new roster and a new front office as well. Let's get to Marcus Stroman because that's big news, and I don't think that was considered a sure thing by anyone for him to come back to the Mets. Mike, I'll give you the floor on this one first. What do you make of Marcus Stroman coming back, signing the qualifying offer, 1 year's $18.9 million?
I think it's a big time move for the Mets. They definitely needed some depth on that pitching staff without Syndergaard last year. And it looks like that they can't just have DeGrom go out there and pitch every game. So to have a guy like Stroman add on to that bullpen, I mean, he wasn't there last year, but does he make the impact this year? I think he does. And listen, Stroman is maybe not top 10, top 15 pitcher, but he's easily in the top 20, top 25 starting pitchers you would want on your team. And I think that's rare to come by in this league. So if you're a Met fan, I think you're happy to see that. And then there's less pressure to go out and get a guy like Bauer. You're more relaxed and you can maybe go after, let's say, a Francisco Lindor or a JT Realmuto, positions you need probably more strongly now that you have Stroman.
I think that Stroman is a great fit for both, not only the team, but also I think he made the right decision coming back on that 1 year deal too, because we know what this market is going to be a disaster. There's no other way to put it. The COVID crisis that has happened in Major League Baseball, the debt is at an all-time high. This market is going to get ugly, and we're going to see a lot of players who maybe replacement level MLB type players who are going to struggle to find work at all. And that really hasn't been an issue in the past, but it's going to be this year. So I look at Marcus Stroman coming off a year where he was he was non-existent in Major League Baseball because of the COVID opt-out. This is a perfect chance for him to re-show his stock, give it another year where maybe Major League Baseball is in a better point next year in terms of the free agent market, and then up his value to a point where he can get a long-term deal. Because personally, I wouldn't be entirely sold if I'm a team on Marcus Stroman. I mean, he hasn't been consistent year in, year out. I mean, he's put together some really good seasons. I think he's a fine number 2 starter right now, and I think that's exactly what the Mets need, because their rotation was such a disaster a year ago. But I think this is the perfect opportunity because you're making $19 million next year. That's a plus in itself. And you have the chance to build yourself to a point where if he puts another year together like he did in 2019, he's going to be lined up for a big contract. And I think the biggest winner of all this is Trevor Bauer, too, because now look at the free agent market for starting pitchers. It's really non-existent right now. He's, bar none, the best guy available, and there's really no argument for a second guy there. And I know it's a COVID market. I know it's an ugly one, but I think his value just skyrocketed with Stroman off the market, and we'll see where he ends up. But I think this is a great fit for Stroman, a great fit for the Mets, and a great fit for Trevor Bauer, too, going into free agency.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree with that. And then if you're the Mets now, you get that worry out, and then maybe you focus on getting bullpen arms. You don't worry about the starting side of it. Get some relievers. Edwin Diaz looked great last year, but he's not the only guy you're going to have there. So you need to build around him and add some bullpen arms, because I think that was probably one of the biggest weaknesses for the Mets this past year. And Stroman's going to help the Mets be able to only target relievers and then maybe a catcher. So I think this is a win-win for both sides, Stroman and the Mets. And then, like you said, Bauer now really has all the cards and all the deck the cards in his hand. So he really gets to make a decision on where he wants to go, and there's not really any competition for him.
Certainly isn't, and it's going to be interesting to see how it unfolds. I want to get your opinion on this before we wrap up, because we talked about it before the show, and it's going to be a big topic of conversation, especially with free agency being such a disaster. Francisco Lindor likely to be traded by the Indians. Do you see the Mets as a potential fit there? I personally am not a huge fan of that outcome for the Mets. I know Lindor is good. He's going to be paid like a superstar. But if I'm the Mets, I think that I would go a different direction in terms of big fish hunting than Francisco Lindor, because to me, the bat hasn't been there in a few years. He had one really, really MVP type caliber season. But other than that, the bat has been plummeting, and he was at league average this year in terms of weighted runs created plus. But what do you think about Francisco Lindor, and do you think the Mets should be a potential destination?
I think the Mets should definitely be involved in Francisco Lindor talks. If they're giving up too much, I don't agree with it then, because the infield's not the biggest concern for the Mets. They're strong in the infield for the most part, so it's not like you're filling a need there. But I think that Lindor's still a top-tier position player in the league. He's still an all-star in my mind, maybe not an MVP caliber player, but to bring someone like Lindor into New York, I think also would bode well for the fan base to have someone they could get around. Lindor's still so young, so he could be there for 6, 7, 8 years and still be in his prime or just out of his prime by the end of that. So I think that would be a good move for the Mets, a team that's had so little for so long. To get a star like that, I think would be a big move for them. Maybe in the baseball terms of the positioning and like, do we need the shortstop right now, or has he been as good, is less of a worry and more just let's get the Mets back on, I guess, a marquee way with this trade. So I think Lindor would be good for those reasons mostly.
That's where like I would worry about the Mets doing something like that, because I think that would be big spending instead of smart spending personally. And I don't entirely disagree that Lindor would be a good fit there. I think that the Mets could use an elite shortstop, which he is. And I don't even think he's a top 5 shortstop, but I think he's certainly top 10 right now. And he's one of the best offensive shortstops in the league. But I think that if I'm the Mets, I'm giving Andre Jimenez a chance at short, and I'm spending that money elsewhere, potentially JT Realmuto, George Springer. Just one of those guys is probably the route I would go. But again, a lot remains to be seen what happens with Lindor. There will certainly be other suitors for him, and we will see what happens. Just about 15 minutes left here on One-on-One. Guys, it's Masters Week, one of the best weeks in America, and it all starts tomorrow. We're going to preview it all, so don't go with us as we got about 15 minutes left in the show. Once again, Mike Calamari, Jackson Heil bringing you to 10:30. Masters Talk when we come back. Wrapping things up here on One-on-One Nightly, Jackson Isle, Mike Calamari, bringing you just about 10 more minutes here left in the show. Shout out to our man Alex Wolves for keeping us on camera this entire time and for not making us look terrible, because he does a great job of making us look great. So thank you to Alex for that. And we're talking about the Masters, which is one of my favorite 4 days in golf, one of my 4 favorite days in the entire year. And yes, it's unprecedented being that it's taking place in the smack middle of November, but listen, it is the Masters and it's happening, and it didn't look like that was going to be the case for a while. So excited to bring that here, and it starts up tomorrow. And Mike, we're going to talk about our favorites to win and who we think can be some underdogs, some dark horses to potentially do some damage. But I want to talk about Bryson DeChambeau first for a second, because it's been a popular conversation to have this week in regards to what he is doing to the golf ball, because he's assaulting it off the tee. There's no other way to say it. I mean, he posted something, I believe, last week that he carried a drive over 400 yards, and that's just carried alone, which is insane to think about. He's carrying a 48-inch driver in his bag this week. He doesn't know if he's going to use it, but he's going to have it in his bag. And there are reports from Augusta today in their annual press conference that they may be changing the course up because of it. I want to come out first and foremost and say I don't agree with that entirely, because first off, DeChambeau, I think he's only shot 3 rounds at Augusta out of 12 under par. First off, and obviously this is a different Bryson DeChambeau than the last time he played Augusta, which was about a year and a half ago. But let's see this guy win here first, because DeChambeau's had trouble with the greens here, lots of trouble with the greens here. And in general, he has become a better putter than he has, and it's a large reason why he was able to win his first major. But Augusta gives people trouble not because of distance in general, but because of what the greens can do. And I want to see personally Bryson DeChambeau win here before we have any talks about extending this course, because they've already had to extend it. I mean, when Tiger tore it to shreds, when he really changed the game in the early 2000s, they already added 600 yards in addition to that from what it was. Let's slow down the talk of completely changing what makes Augusta so beautiful and what makes this course so great, because I want to see Bryson DeChambeau do it first. And personally, I don't think he's going to win this week. I think he's going to have a good tournament, but I think the greens are going to give him too much trouble. And I don't think we should be talking really about significant changes here until we see him walk the walk.
Yeah, I definitely agree. There's no doubt that he was beyond impressive at the U.S. Open, and his ability to drive is unmatched. But I think when it comes down to it at the Masters, the greens might give him trouble, and that's been something with DeChambeau is his putting. And when he was on at the U.S. Open, he was the best golfer there. But I'm not sure if I'm going to get this at the Masters, especially these greens are going to be really tough for him, and they're going to be tough for any golfer, of course. But I think especially for DeChambeau, who has less experience at this course in comparison to other golfers, I'm not ready to give him the green jacket just yet. I'm going to have to wait on that. If I had to pick, I would probably choose between John Ram or Justin Thomas, between the two guys. I think those are probably my top picks for this tournament. Both guys have looked great, and I definitely see them probably at the top 2 of the leaderboards.
First off, how about Rahm skipping one on 16 for that hole-in-one? That was incredible. One of the best golf shots I've ever seen. And it really is fitting to call it a golf shot, because that was the definition of playing the course. So that was really cool to see, and that's a tradition at Augusta every year that I hope to see in person one day, because that's certainly on my bucket list. Thomas is another popular choice too, given the way he's played, and I feel like he's just made to play at Augusta, just with the way his style is and the swagger that he brings. I want to talk about someone probably shouldn't be kind of looked at this way for this tournament specifically, but I don't think he's getting the respect he deserves right now, and that's Brooks Koepka. because let's be honest, we look at 2017 to 2019, Koepka looked untouchable. I mean, crushing the ball, got so much better with the putter. I mean, the guy won U.S. Open at Shinnecock, PGA at Bethpage Black, which are two of the hardest courses in the world. And I still am a believer that when he's healthy, he is the best golfer in the world. He just hasn't been healthy entirely. He is back to full health. He's in a spot where I think he likes to be, which is the media not talking about him a whole lot. And I think that's exactly the spot where you want Brooks Koepka to be, because I know just from being at press conferences with him and asking him questions that he doesn't love dealing with the media. And that's fair, too. That's a completely fair point, because I don't think the media has treated him with the respect that he deserves. But watch out for Brooksy. He's coming in hot this week. He's my favorite to win it all, even coming off the injury. And the last time they were out there, he was the closest guy to catching Tiger. And that was a heck of a story when it happened. But everyone in the world was rooting against Brooks Koepka because it was Tiger. But even when Koepka hasn't won majors, he's been close. And I think that there's no reason to think that he isn't going to come close again, or at least win it.
Yeah, I think the thing you said about he's out of the spotlight now, it almost seems like DeChambeau is taking on that spotlight now that he's the favorite. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to help Koepka, because I think going into the Masters with being the favorite and all that pressure is a lot to hold to go into the Masters with. So I think that helps Koepka. It hurts DeChambeau. And I think now that Koepka is healthy, he's probably one of the favorites too. Maybe not in the league of Justin Thomas and these guys, but I think he's definitely right there behind them, and he can easily come away with the Masters win. And I think another interesting guy, I mean, Tiger Woods didn't won in 2019. It's tough to say because in the U.S. Open, he really was not, his game was not there. But he's always someone you got to look out for, because his iron play is still one of the best out of anybody. And the putting is the big question mark. If he putts well, then who knows? All bets are off. So I think if you keep an eye out for Tiger, I feel like you always have to, because he can make it interesting.
And people won't have trouble with that, because everyone's trying to watch Tiger, of course. And like you said, I mean, it's the driver and the putting. That's been the big concern for Tiger, because even when he won at Augusta, I mean, he was not hitting many fairways in general. And he was scrambling a lot, and he was scrambling successfully, of course. But if he can hit fairways, he's going to have a lot of success at this course. But he hasn't done that lately. And that's been the biggest concern with me. Before we wrap up, I want to talk about a few guys who I think we need to talk about that haven't won majors yet, but could easily be in the hunt here. And the first guy I want to address is Tony Finau, because I think Finau was made to shred this course, and we've seen that in the past. I mean, he's finished top 10 twice in his last 2 times at the Masters. He's a big-time swinger. He's one of the top 5 distance guys in the entire game. And his putting has been terrific lately as well. And he's just a guy who's consistently been in the top 10 of majors. And you just wonder, it's a matter of when and not a matter of if for him. And there's a few guys that I feel that way about, but I think this could be the week where Tony Finau is wearing a green jacket and is winning his first major, because he has the talent and he has the results too, because he's been there. It just hasn't been all put together. And 2 other guys, Xander Schauffele, I want to get to, who consistently also has finished at the top half of majors. He hits a ton of fairways, and he's a guy who can consistently putt as well, which is tough to do at Augusta, which is why I like him this week as well. And Tommy Fleetwood too, who I think can consistently putt it as well, and a guy who has made some big runs on Saturdays and Sundays of major. It's just about being competitive early. Can he stay near the top of the leaderboard early so he has an opportunity to make that big run atop the leaderboard on Saturday or Sunday? So those are the 2 guys I'm looking at. Mike, any sleepers for you going into Thursday?
I think that Jordan Spieth is someone you have to look out for. Excellent putter, falls short in the other aspects of the game, but with these Masters greens, if he comes to play, then you never know what Spieth you're going to get, and maybe you get someone that's on top of their game. Another guy, Kevin Kisner, he's been around for a while. He's 36 years old. He's had some good finishes in the past tournaments at the Zoho Championship. He was pretty solid there. And I think you could see maybe if he has all his game there, maybe he can make a run to win this tournament. I think there's a couple guys that are all in this category. It's Masters week, and you never know what could happen. So it's just going to be a great tournament to watch and to watch unfold.
There are a ton of storylines, obviously, as we mentioned, and excited to watch it all. I mean, I know I'm looking forward to just planting my butt on the couch on Sunday and watching nothing but golf and not having to watch the Jets. It gives me an excuse to watch something else other than terrible gangrene football. So I'm excited for that. Mike, had a great time on this show. Great to talk to you as always, and a pleasure to be with you as well. Once again, shout out to Alex Wolves, as that will wrap up One-on-One Nightly. Once again, from Alex, from Mike, I'm Jackson Heil. Have a great one, everybody.